All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Growing Your Own Food Workshop Series. Today, our gardening experts, Glenn McGourty and Kate Frey, will be talking about warm season vegetables. So a couple things before we begin. For those of you who've been with us before, just a reminder. For those of you who are new, welcome. Just want to make sure that I remind everyone to please leave your audio and video feed off. It'll help with streaming of the webinar. If you have questions to ask of our experts, please use the chat box in your pop-up, and you can pose your question there. You'll have time after their presentations to have a Q&A session and get those answers to you. Also, I want to remind you, hopefully you got a notification from Zoom, but I want to remind you verbally as well, this is being recorded. So my name is Michael Jones. I'm the UC Cooperative Extension Forest Advisor for Mendocino County, and along with Ryan Kiefer, my silent partner, we will be helping to host and moderate this meeting. Before I hand over to Glenn, just like we always do, I have a poll that I would like to launch and ask everyone to answer. We just like to get a sense of who our audience is. So here we go. So we've got a nice mix for everyone from just starting out to we got a lot of master gardeners with us today. All right, so with that, Glenn, if you are ready, I'm going to hand the screen share over to you and you can start your presentation.
So today we're going to shift gears and talk about warm season vegetables, which for the interior part of the region is the most timely thing for us. But also on the coastal area, you should be thinking about warm season vegetables. You have a little bit more limitations, and Kate will get into that. But let's start and see what we can see. So warm season vegetable requirements. First of all, we can't have any frost. Warm season vegetables do not tolerate frost, unlike cool season vegetables. If they get cold weather below 32 degrees, they're going to freeze and be damaged. They need kind of they need warm soil for germination and root growth. So we find 65 degrees Fahrenheit is usually kind of the critical point where they start to germinate and grow. And for some of the more tropical types, like tomatoes and peppers, they may need even more heat to actually germinate. So we recommend using transplants in our kind of limited North Coast region. So for peppers and tomatoes, it's difficult to have enough time to get them to germinate and fruit for you during the growing season. We need a fairly long growing season above 75 degrees Fahrenheit to mature fruit for a lot of things. So that's why the hot weather that we get in the interior parts of California works very well for warm season vegetables. In the lowland heat areas, squashes, pumpkins, and eggplants will do okay. They'll mature in about 70 to 80 days. And then we need higher end for tomatoes, melons, and peppers, about 90 days above 75 degrees Fahrenheit weather most days. And some pollination temperatures have limits, so fruit won't set below 70 degrees Fahrenheit or above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But for most of our area that in the interior, that's not an issue. It becomes more of an issue on the coast. We don't need a lot of pollinators. A lot of these things are self-fertile, even though they have flowers. So nonetheless, some squashes and melons and cucumbers do need to be pollinated. And, we have plenty of wild pollinators here in the North Coast region, so it's not like you have to bring in beehives. Commercial growers might if they were growing melons or something, but for most of our gardens, we have plenty of pollinators. So, of course, we always caution you about using insecticides and things during bloom period that might affect pollinators. It's just a standard good practice not to do that. And what I find in most home gardens is pretty rare that anybody needs to spray anything. We have plenty of and situation where insects are such a big issue that you need to spray. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week when we take on sort of some maintenance and problem shooting and troubleshooting in the garden. So certainly self-pollinating tomatoes, peppers, and beans, no issues with those. Some people will try to help them along sometimes if pollination others not so good. You might use a little toothbrush to kind of help the tomatoes and peppers set. Beans you don't have to worry about. They just seem to take care of themselves. I just want to talk about a couple of really important families that we grow. And the gourd family of Cucurbitaceae is one that's really important in the summer vegetable garden. So that would include everything like pumpkins and melons and summer squashes, winter squashes, and ornamental gourds. These are all members of the same family. They are pretty much an old world family from Africa and Europe, and they're important in the summer garden. Most of the gourds and pumpkin are good in the cooler areas of our gardening zone here, but you need heat to grow things like melons. Squashes, summer squashes are basically winter squashes, which we pick while they're immature, when they still have thin skins. Otherwise, they get all kind of hard and gnarly looking if you leave them grow long enough. Oh gosh, I skipped one of my slides disappeared. I had another group that are very, very important to us, which is the Solanaceae. And the Solanaceae are members of the nightshade family, and that includes tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and potatoes. And they're all related botanically. Most of those vegetables came from the New World. So, and also included that was tobacco. So that was really a game changer for the diet of places like Italy, especially when it wouldn't be the same without tomatoes and peppers. But also peppers spread pretty rapidly through the tropics of the old world in places like India and China, where people really appreciated the pungent flavors of hot peppers. So they also are a very important family represented in warm season vegetables. So in order to make all this work, and I'm sure Kate will mention this as well, it's really important that you have your fertilizer up front to get your plants to take off in a hurry, because they really have to get sort of their solar plant out there, as it were. They got to get their foliage out there to make fruit and produce enough sugars and carbohydrates. So it's really important for the nightshade family. So the tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, eggplant, they like potassium. So you want to be sure you have adequate potassium, and it's worth getting a balanced fertilizer that, the 3 numbers on it. The second number is potassium. Make sure you have potassium for your nightshade plants. And everybody needs nitrogen. You don't have to overdo it, but make sure that there's a little bit of concentrated nitrogen in the garden early on. So if you're using a good compost, great, but it doesn't hurt also just initially to give them a little boost so that they take off and really get growing rapidly, because that's part of the maturation process. You've got to have a big enough plant that it induces it to flower. But you don't want to overdo it either, because if you put on too much nitrogen, you'll get lots and lots of plant and maybe not lots and lots of fruit, or you're seriously delay when flowering and fruiting happens to the point where you won't be able to mature your crop. And as far as irrigation goes, don't let the garden stress. And this is really difficult because initially it's pretty easy to water because, first of all, the temperatures are nice outside. But as it gets towards the end of the season, we get a little bit less enthusiastic about going out in the heat and stuff. That's why it's great if you can set up an automatic timing system so that your garden is always getting water. We'll go into that more next week on maintenance. So that's about all I have for you right now. And we're going to let Kate take over the program and get into individual species and how to manage them in the garden. So Kate, take it away.
All right, so I'm going to talk about growing summer vegetables. Glenn's given us a good overview, and so I'm going to be kind of reiterating some of the information and then showing you some practical ways of growing vegetables. So I wanted to ask Michael if you could please let me know when I've got like 10 minutes before 10. I just couldn't find my phone, and there's no way for me to tell time. Oh, I
Sure, no problem.
I see it on my computer, so I'm good.
Okay.
So as Glenn mentioned, warm season vegetables are not frost tolerant and don't grow or produce well in cold weather. So I think many of us have noticed that in the fall, when we feel like it's still pretty warm, our tomato plants are the plants may look good, but the fruit is will not mature. And so it seems like sort of a paradox because it's really in the inland areas of Northern California, temperatures are really pretty warm and can be warm into November during the day, though the nights can be cold. And so you might think, well, we would get tomatoes, the fruits, for a longer season, but it just really shows that a lot of these warm season vegetables just really need more even and sustained heat. So most of these vegetables are planted around the last frost date, which varies from place to place in Northern California. So it could be in some years as early as April 15th, and other years and other places it can be May 15th. There's a lot of microclimates, and so really pay attention to the temperatures in your specific area. And so where do you find some of this information? About which vegetables are warm season and cool season. Well, seed catalogs have lots of information. The UC Master Gardeners and UC The Garden Web has lots of great information. I just want to point out what this picture is, and I think some of you have been to the Heirloom exposition that's held at the fairgrounds in Santa Rosa in September, and it's sponsored and hosted by the Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds. Well, this is one of the tomato displays, and it just shows you just the incredible variety of tomatoes that there are, and they really have just tremendously different tastes and textures and so can be used in different ways. Some are better for fresh eating, some are better cooked or salads, but there's just such an array of vegetables out there for us to explore. So these summer vegetables are things like tomatoes, of course, tomatillos, ground cherries, squash, pumpkin, cucumbers and melons, peppers, eggplants, okra, celery actually will overwinter. Celery is a great plant, and the flowers are just fabulous the following spring when it flowers. So it's well worth letting it overwinter so you get the incredible fragrant flowers that beneficial insects love. Beans, bush and pole, corn, herbs, and then the herbs, coriander, dill, shiso, or perilla as it's sometimes called, and basil. So there's more, but these are kind of the major categories. And as Glenn mentioned, some of them need to be started early inside because they don't mature if you direct seed them, like tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. And other things are very easy direct seeded, like beans and corn, coriander, dill, basil is easy. So you'll get to know plants over time, or then consult seed catalogs and master gardeners to see about when you should direct sow if that's your choice, or otherwise buy starts. So for those of you who didn't have a chance to see the spring vegetable gardening, and those of you new to gardening, I'll just sort of reiterate some of these other vegetables that we will also be growing now that can grow in cool temperatures, and many of them can tolerate some frost or a lot of frost. But we'll also be planting potatoes now, or a few weeks ago even, root vegetables, onions, garlic leeks, the brassicas, greens, lettuces, and Chinese or Japanese greens. So these are not warm season vegetables, but we will be planting them. I'm sure most of us are going to be planting or have planted these already, or will be in the process. And so these vegetables will mature in the summer, some earlier, some later. And these vegetables grow both in some of them grow only in cool temperatures, like cabbage, like the brassicas, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, and kale, lettuce, and Chinese and Japanese Chinese greens. And so as temperatures warm and humidity drops, then they will come to maturity, and probably best to take a little break until fall. Whereas the root vegetables like beets, carrots, bulb fennel will carry on all season. Onions, garlic, and leeks are really long season, so they will be in your garden until some point in the summer or fall when they're harvested. So when we're starting seeds of these inside, we want to generally plant them 8 weeks before the last frost date. It generally takes about 8 weeks from seeding until transplants are ready. And you could plant these starts in your garden. Though some, like Glenn mentioned, like peppers, grow really slowly and take longer. Some people want to have larger tomatoes than just sort of little 6-pack size, so they'll start them say 12 weeks early, and then maybe they'll have quart or even gallon size plants to put in. A lot of people find it easiest just to buy transplants when they're ready to plant after the last frost date. Or some things like beans and basil, dill, cilantro can be seeded just before the last frost date. And they're, again, really easy to grow from seed. So some of these summer vegetables don't last all season and can be planted in succession. And so we have such long falls, whether you're on the coast or you're inland, and you'll probably find that your cucumbers and summer squash are sort of declining by August and or early September, when it's still salad season, and maybe you're planting lettuce then, and you want cucumbers still for your salads, and you're still in the zucchini mood, and you want zucchinis until the fall, until it frosts. So you may want to plant your zucchini and cucumber, say May 1st, and then follow up with a second planting in June 1st. And that June 1st planting those plants should carry on longer into the fall. So that's just a tip. And I think that, so depending on where you live, plants will carry on or not. So just keep that in mind. I think that the difficult thing is it's almost impossible to find starts in June for these plants, but both of them grow so easily from seed. So you can just direct seed those two things if that's what you're looking for. So with all of these vegetables, all the summer vegetables, we want to look up days to maturity and also spring vegetables to note basic harvest time, because we want to try to have a sustained yield. And let's say we're planting melons, say cantaloupe melons. Well, there's a lot of different varieties of melons. Some are going to mature as early as only 65 days. Others will take about 90 days. So you can plant all your melons, say May 1st or May 15th, but plant different varieties that will mature in different, in a staggered time frame over the summer. And I think we talked about that with broccoli varieties or cauliflower varieties as well, because you don't want to be snowed with a million melons in just 2 weeks of the summer. You really want to have a sustained yield of them. And so again, plant varieties adapted to your area. You want to read the catalog descriptions carefully. And for those of you on the coast, their catalogs are good about talking about which varieties do well in cool climates. And Territorial Seeds seed catalog has quite a lot of these vegetables. I think they're based in Oregon. So, but in any case, many seed catalogs will describe which ones are suitable for coastal or cooler climates. And I think many of us are familiar with, say, black grim tomato that's from the cooler areas of Russia and is often grown in coastal areas. Or early girl tomato has been a longtime favorite, a variety that matures early and is also good on the coast, but there are other ones. Other varieties have great heat tolerance. If you're in a hot area, like the purple of Sicily broccoli is incredibly heat tolerant. In fact, that picture that you see there is taken in Saudi Arabia, of all places, and look at how big and happy those broccoli are. So that was a really great test. Some vegetable varieties are really pretty tolerant of both warm and cool conditions, and some of the seed catalogs are going to denote this. So you don't have to, so there is, life doesn't have to be really complicated. You can focus on some varieties that say have like wide adaptations. And I think Johnny Selected Seeds catalog has quite a lot of varieties with wide adaptations. So as I mentioned, there's just hundreds of varieties available of every given vegetable, whether it's lettuces or tomatoes or squash. This is a picture of just the squash tables at the Heirloom exposition, and it's just such a table of oddities. You just feel like the Martians have landed. And so these varieties don't just appear different on the outside with different forms and colors and sizes and warts and crevices and so on. The flesh is really quite different. Some will be pale and mild flavored and have kind of a soft texture, and other ones are going to be kind of more stringy with thick, really rich flesh. Some will keep a long time, other ones won't. Oftentimes with winter squash, the flavors become intensified as they age. So as the water evaporates from the fruit, and which will concentrate the sugars and the flavors. And so these are keeping varieties like Hubbard squash. But there's just really an array there, and just fun and wonderful varieties. And I think, and also another thing to keep in mind is, well, how large is your sort of household and how much can you eat at one time? And so if smaller households, there's quite a lot of very small squash varieties that sort of one serving or for two people type of squash, or you could grow larger squash and then cut them up and bake them and freeze them. They freeze beautifully. Just one cooking tip is, I grew a lot of butternut squash last summer, and one of our neighbors said he read that you don't have to cut them up, cut them in half and de-seed them to cook them. And so now I just put them and other squash varieties in the oven I just wash the outside and put them in a pan with parchment on the bottom, and I just bake them whole. I don't cut them or de-seed them or anything, and they're so tender and flavorful. And then after they're done, I cut them in half and then I de-seed them. But it just made life so much easier, because trying to cut some of these is really something. Some of them have just amazingly hard flesh, or the covering of the rind is really hard. So that's just a quick tip. So other summer vegetables that you want to plant in succession. So these are summer. Some of these are summer and fall. Well, they will last all summer, but say like beets and carrots may get kind of tough and pithy and hot if you just plant beets once, say like in May 1st. If you expect those beets to last all summer, those beets will be kind of tough and hard, likewise with the carrots. And so you want to plant at around 4-week intervals. So you want to leave some room in the bed so you could do your second interval. Again, so you're not snowed with a huge amount of carrots or beets for one time periods. Green onions as well. So you'll have to sort of judge at your individual garden and just how often you want to space these intervals. Also, some varieties have really last a long time and maintain a really nice soft and flavorful soft texture and have good flavor. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. So lettuce and spinach, of course, they're cool season. but we're still planting them now. We want to plant those every 2 to 3 weeks. You could harvest the entire plant or a head, or you could pick the leaves off for a sustained harvest. And I think a lot of people like to do that. That's going to really prolong the life of the plant. Bush beans, again, don't last all summer. You want to plant them at, say, 3 to 4 week intervals and plant enough plants for sufficient harvest for meals. And again, I mentioned cucumbers and summer squash. We want to think about May 1st, June 1st. You could plant winter squash May 1st for an August harvest. And I think, why wait till the fall? I love winter squash. And so for me, the earlier harvest is better. Or you could plant on June 1st for a fall harvest. I think some of you have probably driven past by some of the pumpkin patches and notice they really don't plant their pumpkins until I think June 1st or June 15th. And so then they're ready right around Halloween. But if you're planting pumpkins or winter squash to eat, then planting earlier is a really great option. Tomatillos, for me, just haven't lasted all summer either, but there may be some varieties that may, and I'm growing a giant one this year that I'm really excited about. So I would, again, probably plant May 1st and maybe May 23rd. But again, the longevity of the plants may differ depending on where you live. So again, seed catalogs can be great sources of technical information, and Johnny Selected Seeds is really top. Most are free. And I wanted to mention a couple other ones. This is another favorite of mine, seeds from Italy. And these seeds, I think most of them are probably imported from Italy, maybe not all, but they have just a remarkable array of radicchios, if there anybody in the audience who like them. So they have both the heading variety, and they have lots of leaf varieties that look very much like lettuce. And these get more bitter as the summer advances and heat builds up. So they're probably best in the spring or fall. You could harvest the whole plant, or you could use scissors and harvest leaves or pick off some of the leaves, but they have a great array of things. They also have a wonderful array of winter squash and other things. So the seed packets are beautifully sealed, and they're usually the amount of seeds in them is robust, and so this is a good catalog to get. They also have a great array of lettuces. I couldn't find my Kitazawa Seed Company catalog, but here's a seed packet. This is the oldest seed company in California, and they've been in business since 1917. And the founding sort of father apprenticed in Japan at a seed company, and then came to San Jose in 1917 and started a seed company downtown in a large warehouse. And so the company was there until 2000, when the family members, I think, had gone on to other things, and it was purchased by someone else, and is now based in Oakland and is going strong, and there's lots of absolutely wonderful Asian vegetables, but also Southeast Asian, some from the Middle East. Amazing array. They have wonderful collections available, recipes in the back. They talk about how all the seeds are how they were used traditionally in these in various countries that they're from. So really just a wonderful resource. And so here's one of their really great carrot varieties. So again, we want to buy quality plants, and don't buy root bound or old plants. And you can often tell because if plants are root bound without popping them out of the 6-pack, because you could kind of squeeze it and look at it and note if the roots are just solid in the little 6-pack or 4-inch pot. And so you want to stay away from those. Even if you pull the plants roots apart, a lot of these annuals vegetables just don't really recover. And so now we may want to think about row covers for early planting, and these again create stable conditions and extend the season both earlier and later. This is a lightweight spun polyester fabric. Remay is a popular brand that floats over the plants and lets light and rain through. So these are so easy and effective. You want to remove them when temperatures stabilize. They're also great for bird protection. I think Glenn mentioned that birds can be a problem with some vegetable seedlings, and certainly I've had a continuing problem with sparrows in the spring, early in the spring, and tremendously in the fall. They seem to migrate out of our area around sort of March, early April, and so the problem goes away. But certainly fall and winter have just been a huge problem for me. So these are really an easy way to create more stable conditions. So as Glenn mentioned, we want to really think about soil. I put fertilizer down first, then compost on top, very lightly dig it in or just plant into it. So note on these beautiful raised beds, the poor foliage cover and lack of vigor on the peppers and the eggplant. So as Glenn mentioned, a certain amount of nutrients of nitrogen is necessary for plants to grow large leaves. And this is really important with plants like peppers and tomatoes and melons, because the fruit can sunburn in warm areas. So you want to have really a nice foliage cover. Also plants with large leaves, again, Glenn mentioned, photosynthesize well and can grow robust fruits. If you're going through all the trouble of creating these nice raised beds and wanting to grow your own food, you really want your vegetables to thrive. I want to say something too with these raised beds about soil temperatures. I went and measured the soil temperature in the raised beds and versus in the ground. And now I'm in Eastern Washington, so it's quite a bit cooler up here than in California right now. And in the tall raised beds like this is for me in Washington, the soil was 65 degrees. In lower raised beds, it was 62 degrees. And in the ground, it was 58 to 60 degrees. So these raised beds really do heat up quickly. But as Glenn mentioned, it's kind of a double-edged sword in hot inland areas, because then they really heat up in those areas. And so you're going to make sure to have to water really pretty often to keep plants from being stressed. So here's a picture of those are healthy peppers in the background here. So this is kind of a hedge of them. And so you could see just really what healthy, happy peppers look like. They're beautiful plants, and especially the chili varieties just can be grown as ornamentals even. This is a hedge of Greek mini basil. So if you like sort of formal hedges, this really makes a great beautiful hedge, and I think it's interspersed here with some lemon basil. But there's lots of fun things you could do in your garden, and you can plant your garden so they are attractive. And of course, everyone needs to irrigate now. Drip irrigation is really easiest. We're going to go over this in more detail in our next and last class. So this irrigation has been turned on probably for 10 minutes, just making a brief dot there. This on the right, the irrigation's probably been on for probably 30 minutes. So the entire bed is wetted. So you could plant radishes, carrots, or tomatoes there. You don't need to change the drip line from year to year. You want to have irrigation in place before planting. And I've got a photo of just a small bed, small raised box coming up, and the irrigation used for it. Plant next to the drip lines. So they're ensuring a fully wetted bed. And you want to use the same system year to year for large plants or small plants. And again, DripWorks, the company, has supplies, schematics, and specifications all online. When you're thinking about seeding, I think there were some questions last week about seeding. So large seeded plants like beans, you could just direct seed, just pop the seed in. Maybe I plant usually 2 seeds at each location. So you could, it's really simple to just plant in the desired spacing. Things like greens that with little seeds, I think this might be spinach. It's a little harder. It takes a little knack to, or a little practice to really understand how thickly or thinly to seed the plants, because these certainly need thinning. Even if you were going to harvest them with scissors for mini greens, it's really too dense. And we'll talk more about that. So a lot of people use the 1/4 inch soaker line. It's really super convenient. Again, notice this is also in a grid instead of the squiggle. We'll talk more about that. So this whole bed is fully wetted. And so whatever we plant in there is, we just use the same system. There's a wonderful schematic from DripWorks. We don't want to mix water distribution systems. This has sprayers and drippers mixed. The sprayers put out way more water and the drippers put out less water per hour, and so basically have drowned the planter. Weed control and pathways, so old carpet or cardboard. Cardboard can be taken away as soil dries and the weeds decline. So again, we want to think about transplanting or direct seeding. So potato spacing is easy. These were whole potatoes. These are spaced about 1 foot apart in this raised bed. And so we're wanting to utilize this raised box fully. So instead of planting 1 row of tomatoes down the middle, we planted 2. And so as the plants grow, we're looking for the plants to utilize the edge here, and even spill over a little, because we really want to utilize all of our growing space and get as much production as we possibly can out of this limited space. So this has been direct seeded. And so these are carrots, kind of hard to see. They're growing kind of slowly. Here they were precisely seeded, and a little hand trowel was used to make really shallow little seed drills. And these are beets. And then it was just with the back of a leaf rake, just really lightly raked over. And then it was hand watered. And this is really demonstrating the watering was a little too vigorous. Maybe the nozzle was too, the spray was too harsh coming from the nozzle. So the beets have kind of washed in a group. So these will probably need to be thinned. Later, the carrots will need to be thinned as well, but not a whole lot. So just things to keep in mind. So these have been planted as starts. So I see this sort of overcrowding situation often in these raised beds. This is Gigante spinach. Doesn't it look great? It's so vigorous. And again, so it's planted at the edge. So we're going to utilize the edge of the box. This is a variety called Galilee that's supposed to be really heat tolerant. Well, I could tell right away it's really a wimpy variety, and it probably won't last that long. So these are probably planted a little too closely, ideally, but it doesn't look like this Galilee spinach is going to last that long. And so it's probably going to be harvested fairly quickly, and then we'll just allow the Gigante spinach to fill that space with its leaves. This is a lettuce, wonderful lettuce called Canasta. It's a large sort of butterhead type with a really wonderful sort of nutty flavor. Well, this gets really big. And so whether you're just pulling the leaves off or you're harvesting the whole head, this is going to fill a space about so big. And then here's another row of it right here. So it probably would have been better just to use the Gigante spinach, 1 row here, and then these 2 rows of the Canasta lettuce. And so if plants get overcrowded, you could just harvest some of them that are crowding the other ones. And these popping in these Galilee spinach is probably just a little too, it's planted a little too closely, but you could just harvest those early. These are basils on the top right. So these will be fairly big plants as well, and we're going to utilize the edge here. So whatever you plant, look up the sort of ultimate size of the plant, and then you'll have to sort of visualize in your mind or measure when you're planting. So you've designed your bed so that you're utilizing all the space efficiently without overcrowding. And so as you get to know these vegetables, it'll become a lot easier. So this spinach and then these two lettuces are probably spaced a little more appropriately than it is now. I see this quite a lot, but there's the thinning as you go theme that really works well too. So with space is, of course, really limited. When you're mixing plants, you want to combine them to size, longevity, and how well they'll occupy the space. So this is an eggplant. I think there's a tomato back here. There's tomatillos. This is some kind of pepper. And so all these plants will last all season. So, and they're robust. They're going to kind of like push the other one. Each plant is big enough and strong enough to sort of keep the other ones at bay. Here's nasturtiums spilling over the bed again. So we're utilizing the edge spaces. These tomatoes are sort of spilling everywhere. So again, utilizing a small space really efficiently. I wanted to mention Rosalind Creasy, who really is one of the people who I think in our modern era re-pioneered edible landscaping. And I think she and her husband lived in Los Altos, probably still do. And she transformed her front yard from a lawn to this beautiful edible landscape. And so it did far more than feed her family. It fed the neighborhood and really created this incredible sense of community. I think the lawns, one by one, succumbed on her street into these wonderful front yard gardens. And the neighbors got together constantly for potlucks and sort of little cooking demonstrations in their houses. And so I think all of our front yards hold this potential, and especially now. And so I just really want to give a big shout out to her and remember her fondly. So seed saving is really easy and fun. I think a lot of people enjoy doing this. Some seeds are really easy to save seed of, like lettuces. Other seed plants will require some isolation, like squash. And so this is the book to get from the library by Suzanne Ashworth. It's been updated. It's been around for a long time. There is so much fascinating information here about each plant. It's not just a dry sort of technical primer on saving seed. And for those of you who've been gardening for a long time, I'm sure all of you have your favorite vegetable varieties, and you may notice that some of them are becoming hard to find, hard if not impossible. And these are just a few of my favorites that used to be more widespread and now are having a really difficult time finding, like that wonderful Italian Canasta lettuce. I'm going to be saving seed of that this summer. Lutz greenleaf beet. This is a beet you could plant in May and it would reach enormous proportions by fall, but still be absolutely sweet and tender. This is almost impossible to find now. Pimiento L is a bell pepper, Italian bell pepper with a pointed end that was so sweet and flavorful and productive. Again, hard to find. Cranshaw melon is another one, a really long season melon with most succulent flesh. So these are things to keep in mind. So front yards and boulevards all hold great potential for vegetable growing. This is our neighbors. We've been helping him, and so with lots of places for the kids to play in between the vegetable boxes. This was a lawn. I think I showed you the picture before. And now is this amazing garden that this really doesn't do it justice. These tomatoes are probably at least 7 feet tall. And so this is tremendously productive, wonderful bed of flowers around the perimeter as well. So I think this garden has probably transformed these people's lives. This is just a tiny garden that's around the corner from me. And this was the family's focus all summer. So they grew all kinds of wonderful melons here, and there's tomatillos and tomatoes, this wonderful wall of sunflowers that had lots of native bees visiting it. Here's another fun raised bed. These are Caterpillar tractor tires that are repurposed into raised beds. These weigh a ton, so it takes equipment to move them, but I'm sure they'll last a lifetime, and they could be configured into different shapes. So again, you could really get creative. So with these are really fancy raised beds. Notice the nice top, great for sitting on. If you can manage this with your raised boxes, this is a really great way to set them up. Notice the plant spacing here. So it's not sort of three plants in a row. I'm not sure what that is. Oh, I think it's Swiss chard, but there's, the plants are kind of staggered here. So again, they're really utilizing the amount of space that is available. These are raised boxes made from tin with 4x4s here on the corners. This is pipe insulation on the top so you don't cut yourself, but these have got a tremendous amount of growing area here. And this is a really narrow side yard. And this is just a wonderful candy jar of tulips and iris in the spring. So this is another community garden. And these were the first people I met in town in Walla Walla. And because of the garden, and they meet people all the time because of the garden. So these gardens are really speaking to people, and people walk by purposely all the time to see what they're doing and visit. So many vegetables are ornamental, and so if you're using them, in this case, as these wonderful purple cabbages as a flower bed border, use the really long season cabbages. I just recently found one that's 110 days. I think these were 90 days. I think these are giant purple, and so think about vegetables as ornamentals too, and then you could eat them when you're ready. So this is another sort of fancy garden, but notice this plant spacings and the placement of plants. So the larger plants are in the back. So there's sunflowers in the back, a row of tomatoes, and then a row of basil, peppers, and eggplants here in the front. Notice these fancy little teepees to support the peppers, which can sort of fall over, and the eggplants. These are just made from little bamboo stakes. They're really easy, really cheap. These are heavy duty wire rings. So there's the same garden later in the summer. And so again, you might think that, gosh, that is so much wasted space. I'm going to plant my tomatoes more closely. But as the season goes, as Anna mentioned, plants really grow and develop. So you really want to keep in mind the ultimate shape and growth. This is just another remarkable garden. This is at the Healdsburg Senior Living community, and my mother is here. And so they have both assisted living and skilled nursing and rehab. And Tony Fisher, who is the marketing and the community relations manager, took this just vacant lot back of the facility, just was rubble next to the parking lot, and he turned it into this incredible garden, this huge vegetable and flower garden. And then over time, he's had all these physical therapy bars and equipment installed in it. There's wonderful seating areas for families, residents, and the staff, I should mention. He's added worm boxes, he's got beehives, he's got therapy chickens, therapy goats. Just absolutely remarkable person. He thought about what will people of many of the, of the sort of era of their residents, what would make them feel comfortable, and what can they be engaged in. And so he thought a garden, and with lots of colorful flowers to perk up people and to stimulate them and to make them happy. And so every year it just gets better and better. And these are these wonderful fluorescent celosia brains that one of the workers found and planted. So whole front yards could get turned into pumpkin patches. And wow, isn't that a great improvement on a lawn? And so trellising is important too. I think that we don't realize how big some of these plants get. These are the Japanese cucumbers. These are such an improvement on the English ones. Their skins don't get bitter, no matter how hot it gets. They're always super tender and sweet, but they grow huge. So these are pretty fancy, but those livestock panels make wonderful, wonderful cucumber trellises. And I'll show you a melon trellis. And so really make harvesting a lot easier. I'm sure all of us have had cucumber plants that sprawl over the ground and we find enormous cucumbers hidden underneath that we failed to notice. So these are those livestock panels, the shorter version of them. These are melons. And so a great way to utilize your space. And so if you've got raised boxes, to think about these things. This is a giant pumpkin that grew on our shed roof last year. So it was a volunteer, and so danger, this grew to enormous size. And this year we planted smaller pumpkins to do the same thing. So there's all kinds of fun things you could do if you don't to utilize space. And so we want to plant for beneficial insects and pollinators. Lissom is simple. We'll talk more about that next week. Here's another wonderful vine solution. Some people bend those livestock panels and use them for trellises, for gourds, beans, cucumbers, and so on. So again, you can really make some wonderful decorative details and utilize space efficiently. So again, this is a garden in Sebastopol, a winery garden. This is at the end of the summer, probably September. Look at the vibrant health of the vegetables still. These are kales. This is that Italian kale, and then the red boar kale. Look at the health and of them even so late in the season, and that really comes from a focus on healthy soil, and so compost and fertilizer, and then lots of flowers for beneficial insects and pollinators. So all of these things, so all of these factors and plant spacing and really act together to create a healthy garden. So I think that is the last slide. So I think we're ready to take some questions now.
So one of the first questions we got was back when Glenn was talking about pollinators. And Glenn, it's kind of a specific question, but it was related to, they're growing greenhouses because they're on the coast. And so, what's a good way to help encourage or support pollination if you're growing in a greenhouse? Can you just open the doors at certain times of the day, or what's a way to help with that kind of concern that the growers are having?
Yeah, it depends what you're growing. So opening the doors obviously would work. Sometimes pollinating with is a way that commercial greenhouse growers do it. They just touch the flowers like of tomatoes and things and let them buzz a little bit with an electric toothbrush, going back and forth between, like if you're trying to grow cucumbers, between the male and the female flowers, you need to recognize what they look like using an electric toothbrush. So those are some of the things that are done commercially.
Yeah, and I could just add on to that, like with,
Sure.
Obviously the open door sounds like the easiest way, but also for tomatoes, wind acts to vibrate the flowers. So if, particularly if tomatoes are grown on a string, then you can, as a single stalk on a string, which is a lot of work, you can kind of flick the string to make the whole plant sort of vibrate, and that actually really does act to help dislodge some of the pollen. I've seen big swamp coolers and greenhouses cause a great wind and have then had tremendous tomato production from that. But I think probably just opening the door so the bees can find some of these plants.
Yeah.
And probably even a little electric leaf blower could be used too, and kind of slow speed. Don't blow the plants out of the greenhouse, but just kind of blow up and down on them for wind pollinated things. That would help as well. How
long would you have to do that? How often? Is it just like a one-time thing where as soon as they're flowering, you're blowing them for a minute to get the pollen dispersed, or?
You're probably doing this daily.
Okay.
As new flowers are emerging.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe trying to open the door is the best because it's the least amount of work for you. But if you're going to do it, synthetically, you're going to be putting a lot of time into it. All right, we had a lot of interest and questions on kind of this planting in intervals. So one question, which some of these I hadn't really thought about, but if you're doing interval planting, is it acceptable to just plant the same variety but in small batches? So for example, maybe planting the same type of tomato, but you're spreading out over a period of time, or is it better to use different varieties?
I think you could just certainly use the same variety. Let's say you're interval planting radishes or carrots. I think you want to use up what's in your seed packet, and or again, that other tactic was using if you're planting something like melons, again, just planting varieties that mature at different dates. So
yeah.
2 days. I think
okay.
So. Some things like I didn't go so much. So dill and cilantro are both plants that mature fairly quickly, and so those are really easy to direct seed at intervals. You probably don't need an amount of either of them. So again, you always want to keep in mind, so how much can I use at one time?
Okay. I thought this was interesting. Again, related to planting in intervals, is it a temporal, right? You're planting in different intervals in time, or are you also spacing differently based on how you are, treating that interval? So is it like, are you spacing the seeding or the starts in the garden at different spacing intervals as well as at different times, or can you just do a full planting and then at different harvest and then replant? How's the best way to approach that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think oftentimes you would plant just kind of a little block of something, whatever it is. Let's say you're planting bush beans, because beans will not. So you want to have your next planting underway before your initial planting is finished, because you don't want to go beanless, say, at a certain point in time. So that's why you have a staggered planting, and so you'll have to leave a dedicated bed space or a place and area in your raised boxes for that. So you always want to think ahead.
So another strategy that I've seen gardeners do, particularly with corn, is to plant different maturing corn at the same time, so that they only plant once, but they know that they've got different maturation dates. They go from early to late, because sometimes they find it hard to get back in and start things all over again. So so when you've got different types of vegetable cultivars that mature at different rates from 80 to 110 days, then you plant once, but you plant with different ones and you have sequential ripening.
Okay, that's a great idea. All right, let's move on. There's a question, Kate, when you're talking about providing, cover for your crops so that you don't bake them in the sun. What's a good percent cover, right? If you're planting under trees, you obviously don't want to have 100% canopy cover, but what's like what are you aiming for? And then what really question that was asked was what would be a good type of foliage cover? So, you know, if you don't have trees, can you use shade cloths, or what's kind of other options you can to set up, you know, that protection?
Well, really the best protection is the plant's own leaves, rather than, I think generally most of these vegetables do best in full sun. And I think that, I don't know, Glenn may know whether it's at least 6 or 8 hours of sun a day. I would say is probably 8 hours for most of the vegetables is ideal. And so you really don't want any shade cover. And the best shade is the shade from the leaves of the plants themselves, like pepper leaves. Pepper leaves should shade peppers, melon leaves should shade the melons, and so on. And so just trying to grow really robust, healthy plants that can shade the fruit so they don't sunburn is the best thing. I have seen some shade cloth used in hot areas for, say, bell peppers. But again, I think you want to try to grow robust plants. I think that some of the seed catalogs have in their descriptions say good foliage cover on the plants. And so you may want, if you're in a hot area, you may want to focus on those varieties.
Yeah, I think Kate has the right philosophy there of not using shade cloth if you don't need it, and probably peppers is one that tend to sunburn in really hot climates, and trying to keep your foliage there is the trick. And in fact, commercially, bell peppers are some of the biggest nitrogen users. Commercial growers may use as much as 300 pounds per acre, and most crops do pretty good with 100. So, and in terms of hours of sunlight, most plants need a minimum of 6 hours to be able to photosynthesize properly, and more would be better. So the more sunshine we've got for our garden, the better off things are going to grow.
All right. Couple more questions with the time we have left. Is there any issues with using sunflowers in permaculture beds? Somebody mentioned they heard that they can, you know, put toxins in the soil that might affect the growth of other plants. Is there any issues with sunflowers mixed beds?
Well, the only issue with sunflowers is they're usually large and robust, and their leaves are, their roots are vigorous, and really will impact vegetables grown next to them. So I would plant them a good 4 feet away from vegetable plants for that reason. And the leaves, when they're healthy too, the leaves can be large and can shade plants that are growing near them.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah, this is an interesting question. What about, are there any vegetables you can plant that deer won't eat?
Well, at the Mendocino Coast Botanical Garden, they before they got their deer fence in, their pumpkin patch and winter squash patch was outside the deer fence of their vegetable garden. And the deer did not touch them, and I just was astounded, as well as their dahlia. So I still can't quite believe it, but that it was that way for numbers of years. So that's something to try.
Okay.
I don't know.
All right.
Ideas.
Well, my experience is that deer will eat anything if they're hungry enough. It just depends. If they've got something else nice to eat, they'll get that first. But that is an interesting observation that Kate made, and I know it to be true.
All right. There's a lot of talk at the end about trellising squash and cucumbers and your pumpkin or your vine vegetables. Any kind of, some people are saying they had trouble with it, they weren't very successful. People were concerned about maybe the weight of the vegetables on the trellising. Do you have any kind of additional recommendations or guidelines for going about trellising some of these types of vegetables?
I think every trellis needs good staking. So whether it's a 4x4 or it's vineyard T-posts, and the trellises need to be tall enough, like tomato cages, the sort of the cheap ones that you buy that are really only about 3 or 4 feet tall are really vastly undersized for the size and the weight of most tomato plants. And so you really want to go up to like 5, 6 feet. And so having something really sturdy and those livestock panels are really great. You could cut them into pieces with bolt cutters, and so use them in raised boxes as well. I think Glenn may have something to add.
Well, I think the key thing is support. T-posts work pretty good. You can drive T-posts in relatively easily. They're not expensive as opposed to, digging big holes and putting in 4x4 pressure treated posts. So T-posts work good, and they kind of disappear as the foliage grows in. So that's kind of a nice thing. But Kate's a champion at repurposing stuff and making things grow pretty on them. Watching her all her years in the Valley Oaks garden, she made lots of pretty trellises out of really inexpensive material, and I think it's good to use your imagination. You don't have to buy really expensive stuff to do that. As far as using string and so forth, really time consuming, but it works.
Here's another like a cheap, easy, wonderful. It's TP material, so not for trellising, but for growing pole beans. If you want to make a TP for for the kids or grandkids or yourself, you can reed bar, the concrete reinforcing bar. You could buy it from steel companies in 20-foot lengths, and then oftentimes they will cut it for you, or you can cut it with a hacksaw. And so if you, I think we used about 9-foot lengths of it, and then pounded it about 1.5 feet in the ground. And I think we had 4 legs to the teepees, and then tied the top with wire. We stood on a ladder to do that. And we grew wonderful gourds on them. So you could probably grow pumpkins, but certainly flowering vines, pole beans, probably those Japanese cucumbers would be great on them, and just really made an artistic statement. So, and will last forever and ever. And then you could easily take them down and then put them away for the winter, and then use them.
From your pictures, one of the coolest kind of cage trellises I saw was somebody had taken a wine barrel and removed the staves, but used the rings and had supported the ring, so it looked like a deconstructed skeletonized wine barrel. I thought that was a really cool way to do that.
Yeah.
We also had a really great comment in the chat box. Somebody said they live near the botanical gardens on the coast in Mendocino, and the deer didn't touch their winter squash for 4 years. But once they figured out what they were, they came back and tasted every squash. So
that's typical.
Yeah. So there was a few questions that we won't get to. We're pretty much out of time, but there's a few questions on fertilizers and watering. I will say that we addressed soil and fertilizing in the first talk, so people can go back and watch that. And we'll also probably talk a little bit more about that next week when we talk about garden care. I think with that, we've pretty much worked our way through the questions, and we'll post some of this dialogue on the website with the video. So I just want to remind everyone, well, first of all, thank you to our experts, Kate and Glenn, for their time and for this really fascinating topic, and the information provided is extremely valuable. Next week, we'll be talking kind of, I guess, synthesizing everything and tying it into caring for your garden. So maybe incorporating everything we've talked about into best practices. So that's next week, next Saturday, again at 9. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. And these videos will be posted on our website. So Ryan has been posting that link. So go ahead and check that out if you have additional questions on topics that we already covered. Do our experts have any last minute thoughts or anything to say before we end this webinar?
Yes, I just want to tell you, next week we're going to be joined by yet another guest, and that's Greg Giusti, who's going to talk about vertebrate pests, being gophers and deer and skunks and raccoons, and they do occasionally show up as a problem, and Greg's an expert at it, so he's going to be on with us for part of the discussion. And we're going to kind of talk about how do you keep things growing, because Kate's got these wonderful pictures, but you know, a lot happens between when you put the seed and the transplant in and when you get to harvest. So that's what we're going to focus on.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right, great. Well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in.